the 1st of September, 1939. Berlin, Germany. The clatter of boots echoed through the marble corridors of the Reich Chancellery as dawn broke over a city already awake with anticipation. Radios crackling and typewriters hammering, the sound of a nation stepping into war. In a windowless communications room deep inside the building, Oberleutnant Franz Adler adjusted his headphones and leaned closer to the Enigma machine bolted to the desk in front of him, its matte black casing cool beneath his fingertips. Outside, artillery thundered across the Polish border. But here the war arrived as pulses of electricity, each keystroke clicking like a metronome of destiny. Adler had been trained to trust this machine with absolute faith. The Enigma was not merely a tool, it was a promise, engineered by Germany's finest minds, protected by mathematics so complex that even its creators spoke of it with reverence. As Adler typed the daily key, rotors spinning with mechanical certainty, he believed, like every officer in the Wehrmacht, that no enemy alive could read what passed through these wires. Across Germany, from U-boat pens on the Baltic coast to Luftwaffe airfields preparing for sorties at first light, thousands of Enigma machines came alive at the same moment. Synchronized to the Reich's clock, each operator followed rigid protocol, swapping rotors, aligning rings, consulting codebooks stamped GHAM, the ink still smelling sharp and new. Messages poured in, troop movements, fuel requests, orders signed by generals whose names would soon be carved into history. In the minds of German planners, the Enigma rendered these words invisible once they left the room, scrambled into meaningless chaos. The confidence was not misplaced, at least not in theory. The Enigma's polyalphabetic cipher, with its ever-changing electrical pathways, generated astronomical numbers of possible settings. Even if an enemy captured a machine, the daily key would change at midnight, locking yesterday's secrets behind a wall of permutations no human could climb. This belief had become doctrine. General der Nachrichtenoffiziere Erich Feldgiebel, overseeing communications security, assured his superiors that the system was invulnerable. He had engineers, mathematicians, and physicists backing him, men who spoke in equations rather than doubts. In Berlin cafes, scientists from Siemens and the Reichspost boasted quietly that Enigma was safer than any fortress of concrete and steel. As the invasion of Poland unfolded, success seemed to confirm their certainty. German columns advanced with terrifying speed, coordinated by radio messages no Polish or Allied listener could understand. Orders flew faster than couriers, and chaos followed wherever the Wehrmacht appeared. To the men at their machines, Enigma felt like a weapon as decisive as any Panzer or Stuka. Yet even as Adler sent his final transmission before noon, unaware fingers elsewhere in Europe were already probing the machine's defenses. In Warsaw, Polish cryptologists had spent years studying Enigma's inner logic, treating it not as magic, but as a system, one that could be understood, and perhaps broken. Though their country now burned under German attack, their work would not die with it. By nightfall, secret documents and reconstructed Enigma replicas would be spirited out of Poland, bound for allies who did not yet grasp their value. Back in Berlin, Adler removed his headphones and stretched, the air thick with cigarette smoke and optimism. A fellow officer joked that the war might be over by Christmas. Adler smiled, confident that whatever the future held, the enemy would remain deaf and blind to Germany's intentions. He shut down the Enigma, its rotors settling into silence, never suspecting that the machine he trusted so completely had already begun to betray the Reich. The 25th of July, 1939. Pyry Forest, outside Warsaw, Poland. Rain pattered softly against the canvas roof of the camouflaged hut as Captain Gustav Herrling adjusted his greatcoat and glanced toward the tree line, where armed sentries stood motionless among the pines. Inside, the air was thick with tension and damp wool. 3 wooden tables had been pushed together, and atop them lay objects that, to an untrained eye, looked unremarkable metal boxes, wiring diagrams, stacks of punched cards. To the men gathered here, they were nothing less than the skeleton key to Germany's most closely guarded secret. Marian Rejewski stood at the center. Thin, bespectacled, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. A mathematician by training, He had spent the better part of a decade staring into the heart of the Enigma, reducing its mystery to numbers and logic. Across from him sat representatives of Britain and France, Commander Alastair Denniston of British intelligence and Major Gustave Bertrand of the French Deuxième Bureau. They had arrived skeptical. They would leave stunned. Rejewski began without flourish. He described how the Polish Cipher Bureau had reconstructed the Enigma's wiring using pure mathematics, exploiting weaknesses not in the machine itself but in the way humans used it. He spoke of permutation theory, of message keys repeated twice at the start of transmissions, of patterns that emerged only to those patient enough to look. As he spoke, he lifted the lid of one of the metal boxes. Inside was a fully functioning replica of the German Enigma. Denniston leaned forward, his skepticism dissolving into disbelief. For years, British cryptanalysts had dismissed Enigma as impenetrable. Here, in a forest hut under threat of invasion, the Poles were calmly explaining that they had been reading German traffic since the early 1930 seconds. Bertrand felt a chill despite the summer heat. He understood immediately what this meant and what would be lost if Poland fell. The meeting stretched on for hours. The Poles revealed their Bomba Cryptologiczna, an electromechanical device designed to test Enigma settings at speed. They handed over wiring diagrams, methods. There was no bargaining, no conditions, only urgency. Rejewski's colleague, Jerzy Rojicki, spoke quietly of time running out. German changes to Enigma procedures had already made their work harder. Poland lacked the industrial capacity to keep up. The invasion they all sensed coming would end everything. As dusk settled over the forest, Denniston finally spoke. He promised that Britain would take this knowledge and continue the fight. It was not a vow of victory, only of effort, but it was enough. Within weeks, German armies crossed the Polish border, and Warsaw burned. Rejewski and his team fled, first east, then south, carrying what they could in their memories. Many of their notes were destroyed to prevent capture. Some of the men would not survive the war, but the essence of their work had already escaped. In Britain, crates arrived quietly at a secure facility north of London. They were logged without ceremony, assigned reference numbers, and wheeled into rooms where men in tweed jackets and loosened ties waited with curiosity. Bletchley Park did not yet know what it had received. The estate was still a work in progress, a former Victorian mansion surrounded by hastily constructed wooden huts. Rain turned the paths to mud. Telephones rang constantly. Typewriters never stopped. Here, mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, and eccentrics gathered under a veil of secrecy so thick that many did not know what the others were doing. Among them was a young Cambridge mathematician named Alan Turing, tall, awkward, with a distant gaze that suggested his thoughts were always somewhere else. He said little, but as wiring diagrams were unrolled and explanations given, his mind began racing ahead. Turing understood machines. More importantly, he understood processes. The Polish work did not make Enigma easy, but it made it possible. As summer turned to autumn and Europe slid into war, Bletchley Park transformed. Huts multiplied. Staff numbers swelled. Security tightened. The Enigma problem became a priority that consumed entire sections. Turing and his colleagues studied German procedures obsessively, noting every habit, every mistake. They learned the rhythms of enemy operators, how fatigue crept in, how arrogance bred shortcuts. Each intercepted message was copied, categorized, and fed into an ever-growing system of analysis. Still, success was elusive. The Germans changed keys daily. Sometimes messages went dark for weeks, but now there was a foothold. What the Poles had begun in isolation, under constant threat, was being reborn with British resources behind it. Late one night, as Turing walked alone across the darkened grounds, the hum of generators echoing faintly from the huts, he paused and looked up at the sky. He did not think in terms of nations or flags. He thought in terms of time. If they could read Enigma not tomorrow, not next year, but soon lives could be saved on a scale no battlefield heroics could match. Somewhere across the channel, German officers typed with confidence, believing their words vanished into mathematical oblivion. They had no idea that the first cracks in their perfect cipher had already crossed borders, survived invasion, and found a new home. And at Bletchley Park, the race to exploit those cracks had begun. The 11th of January 1940. Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. Frost clung to the bare branches lining the drive as Alan Turing cycled through the gates of Bletchley Park, his scarf flapping loose in the wind, his mind already several steps ahead of the day. Inside Hut 8, the air was sharp with cold and tension. Coal fires burned low, and condensation fogged the windows as operators hunched over desks littered with cipher sheets and half-empty mugs of tea. The war had settled into a grim rhythm, and so had the work. German radio traffic filled the airwaves in a steady, merciless stream. Every dot and dash, every burst of static, was captured by listening stations along Britain's coast and rushed here for interpretation. Most of it remained stubbornly unreadable. The Enigma had not yielded easily. Turing removed his coat and moved straight to the blackboard, where permutations and rotor paths from the previous night's effort still crowded the surface. He spoke little, but his presence altered the room. Others sensed it, the quiet urgency, the refusal to accept that something could not be done simply because it had never been done before. The polls had shown the door could be opened. Now Turing intended to force it wide. He believed the solution lay not in brilliance alone, but in speed. Human minds, no matter how gifted, could not test Enigma's settings fast enough. But machines could. Drawing on the Polish Bomba and his own theoretical work on computation, Turing proposed something radical. An electromechanical device that would automate the hunt for Enigma keys. It would not decode messages directly. Instead, it would eliminate impossibilities at a pace no team of humans could match. Many were skeptical. Resources were scarce. Britain was fighting for survival. Factories were already stretched, producing aircraft and artillery. But Denniston approved the experiment. There was nothing left to lose. Turing worked alongside engineer Harold Doc Keane of the British Tabulating Machine Company. Together, they translated theory into hardware. The result was called the bombe, a tall, clattering array of drums and wires that looked more like an industrial loom than a weapon of war. Each drum represented an Enigma rotor. As the bombe ran, it simulated thousands of rotor combinations, hunting for logical contradictions that would rule them out. The key insight was the crib. German operators, creatures of habit, often used predictable phrases, Wetterverhörsage for weather reports, Heil Hitler at the end of messages. If a guessed plaintext could be aligned with a ciphertext, the bombe could test whether that alignment was possible under any Enigma setting. If not, it moved on. If yes, it flagged a potential solution. The first bombe came online in March 1940. When it started, the noise filled the hut, a relentless mechanical roar punctuated by clicks and whirs, as if the building itself had come alive. Operators stood by, watching indicator lights flicker. Most runs ended in failure. Some took hours. But then, one afternoon, a stop was called. A setting had survived. Hands moved quickly. The configuration was checked on a real Enigma machine. Keys were aligned. A message was typed in. German words emerged. For the first time at Bletchley Park, Enigma traffic from the current day lay exposed on the page. There was no cheering, no celebration, only a shared, silent understanding of what had just happened. Within weeks, the implications became clear. Decoded messages revealed U-boat positions in the North Sea, Luftwaffe readiness levels, and logistical weaknesses. This intelligence, carefully disguised and selectively acted upon, began flowing to commanders under the codename Ultra. It was information so sensitive that only a handful of senior officers were allowed to know its source. Orders were adjusted subtly. Convoys were rerouted by chance. Enemy patrols were avoided just often enough to save ships without revealing the pattern. Meanwhile, in Germany, confidence remained unshaken. Communications officers noted Allied successes but attributed them to espionage, bad luck, or coincidence. The Enigma's reputation as unbreakable endured. In June 1940, as France collapsed and British troops evacuated from Dunkirk under fire, Enigma intercepts provided a rare sense of clarity amid chaos. Turing and his colleagues read German assessments of the evacuation in near real time. They saw uncertainty, overconfidence, missed opportunities. It did not change the outcome, but it sharpened the understanding of how close Britain had come to disaster. The pace at Bletchley Park became brutal. Turing slept irregularly, sometimes on a camp bed beside his desk. He ate when reminded. His mind moved relentlessly forward, already anticipating German countermeasures. He knew the enemy would not stand still, and he was right. In the summer of 1940, the Germans altered their procedures again, increasing the number of rotors in use and tightening message discipline. Keys vanished overnight. Days passed without breaks. The huts filled with frustration. Some feared the window had closed. Turing refused to accept it. He reworked the Bombay design, introducing improvements that allowed faster testing and greater flexibility. New bombs were ordered, their production scattered across Britain to reduce vulnerability to air attack. As the Battle of Britain raged overhead, with German bombers droning across the English sky, Bletchley Park worked on, often under blackout conditions. Windows covered, lights dimmed. The war in the air and the war of codes ran in parallel, each influencing the other in ways few would ever know. One evening, as the distant thud of explosions echoed from London, a young cryptanalyst asked Turing if he thought their work truly mattered. Turing paused, chalk in hand, eyes unfocused. "It matters," he said simply, and returned to the board. By the end of 1940, Enigma was no longer invincible. It was dangerous, resilient, and unpredictable, but it was readable. German scientists and engineers still believed their creation secure. They would not learn the truth until long after the war was over. For now, the advantage lay with a quiet group of men and women in wooden huts, racing not only against the enemy, but against time itself. The 17th of October, 1940. Western approaches. North Atlantic Ocean. The sea heaved under a slate-gray sky as able seaman Thomas Reed tightened his grip on the cold metal rail of the destroyer HMS Vanoc, eyes scanning the endless waves for any sign of a periscope's telltale wake. The wind carried the smell of salt and oil, and somewhere beneath the rolling surface, German U-boats hunted in silence. Convoys were Britain's lifeline. Every sack of grain, every drum of fuel, every crate of ammunition had to cross this hostile expanse, and the enemy knew it. From bases along the French coast, wolf packs of submarines fanned out, coordinated by radio, guided by intelligence transmitted through Enigma. At BUDU headquarters in Kurneval, near Lorient, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz studied situation maps lit by shaded lamps. Pins marked convoy sightings. Arrows traced projected intercepts. U-boat commanders reported positions, fuel states, torpedo counts. Orders flowed outward, encrypted, precise. Dönitz trusted the system completely. He believed his communications invisible, his strategy unreadable. Back on HMS Vanoc, Reed felt the ship shudder as the engines surged, the captain altering course yet again. No explanation was given. None was needed. Orders came down from Western Approach's command with increasing frequency changes that seemed uncannily well-timed. Convoys turned away from danger just hours before attack. Destroyers arrived in patrol zones where no enemy had been reported, only to find U-boats waiting. The sailors joked about lucky guesses. Some spoke of intuition. None suspected the truth. In Hut 8 at Bletchley Park, the Atlantic War unfolded on paper. Interceptors captured U-boat transmissions day and night. The staccato bursts of Morse code rushed by motorcycle courier to Buckinghamshire. There, teams worked against the clock. Naval Enigma was more complex than the Army version. Additional rotors, stricter procedures, fewer operator errors. Breaking it was a constant struggle. Days without success meant ships sunk, men drowned, cargo lost. Then, a break would come. A weather report, a patrol order, a careless repetition. The bombs roared into motion. When a key was found, the room tightened with urgency. Messages were translated, evaluated, cross-referenced. Information was passed up the chain, stripped of any hint of its origin. At the Admiralty, officers received ultra-summaries with sober faces. They knew the cost of a mistake. If the Germans suspected Enigma was compromised, they would change everything. So decisions were made with restraint. Sometimes convoys were left to sail into danger because acting would reveal too much. Those choices haunted the men who made them. In November 1940, Enigma decrypts revealed a massing of U-boats south of Iceland. The intelligence was clear, so was the risk. The Admiralty authorized a diversion. Convoys were rerouted north, closer to Arctic waters. Storms battered the ships. Ice formed on decks. But they lived. Weeks later, German reports expressed confusion. Targets had vanished. Opportunities missed. Dönitz fumed, blaming reconnaissance failures and poor weather. He ordered tighter discipline, more radio silence. But the need to coordinate remained, and so did the transmissions. On Vanok, Reed stood watch as depth charges rolled off the stern, explosions blooming underwater like muffled thunder. A U-boat had been detected almost by accident, it seemed. After the attack, oil surfaced. Debris followed. There were no survivors. Reed felt no triumph, only exhaustion. He did not know that hours earlier, a message decoded at Bletchley Park had placed that submarine directly in Vanok's path. By early 1941, the tide in the Atlantic began, slowly, to shift. Losses remained heavy, but patterns emerged. U-boat patrol lines were disrupted. Refueling rendezvous were ambushed. Supply submarines Milchka became priority targets after Enigma revealed their schedules. Each success compounded the next, yet the Germans saw only fragments. Scientists and engineers at the Chiffrierabteilung reviewed Enigma's design repeatedly. They found no flaw. The mathematics held. The wiring was sound. Any suggestion that the cipher itself was broken was dismissed. The idea that Allied mathematicians could outthink German science was unpalatable and, to many, inconceivable. Instead, suspicion fell on spies, compromised crews, chance, never the machine. At Bletchley Park, the pressure intensified. Naval keys changed more frequently. Sometimes the code went dark for days. When that happened, the Atlantic bled. Ships burned. Men froze. The silence was unbearable. When a new key finally fell, the relief was tempered by the knowledge of what had been lost in the interim. Alan Turing watched this battle from behind layers of paper and procedure. He understood the stakes more clearly than most. Every improvement to the bombus, every shortcut found, translated directly into lives saved at sea. He pushed relentlessly, arguing for more machines, more staff, more urgency. Slowly, he was heard. By the spring of 1941, additional bombs came online. Throughput increased. The lag between interception and action shrank. For the first time since the war began, Britain's survival at sea no longer felt like a desperate gamble. On the German side, confidence persisted. Reports to Berlin emphasized Allied losses, not the narrowing margins. U-boat commanders still believed themselves masters of the deep. When they sent messages home, requests, sightings, reassurances, they did so without hesitation. Each transmission was a thread. At Bletchley Park, those threads were being woven into a picture of the enemy's entire campaign. The Atlantic remained vast, cold, and deadly, but it was no longer unknowable. And in that quiet shift, unseen by those who sailed above and below its surface, the balance of the war began to tilt. The 9th of May, 1941, North Atlantic, south of Iceland. The destroyer HMS Bulldog cut through rough seas as dawn crept over the horizon. Its decks slick with spray and tension hanging in the air like cordite. Lieutenant David Balmy stood near the bridge, binoculars pressed to his eyes, focused on a patch of churning water where moments earlier a German submarine had been forced to the surface. U-110 lay crippled, its conning tower scarred, its crew scrambling in panic. Depth charges had done their work. Now came the gamble. As Bulldog maneuvered closer, Balm heard the sharp crack of rifle fire and the shouted orders of German voices carried by the wind. The submarine was not yet sinking. Its captain, Fritz Julius Lemp, believed he still had time to save his boat, or at least deny it to the enemy. But confusion reigned. Some valves had been opened, others had not. Balme did not wait for certainty. With a small boarding party, he leapt onto the wet steel deck of the U-boat, boots slipping as the sea surged around them. Inside, The submarine was eerily quiet, abandoned. Water trickled through compartments, but the vessel stubbornly refused to die. In the radio room, Balme froze. There, bolted to a desk, sat an Enigma machine. Beside it were codebooks, current ones. For a split second, he understood the enormity of what he was seeing. He ordered everything seized. The boarding party worked fast, hands shaking as they ripped manuals from shelves, stuffing them into canvas bags. Moments later, Bulldog pulled away. U-110 finally slipped beneath the waves, taking its dead with it. Officially, the submarine had been destroyed with all hands. The truth was sealed behind layers of secrecy. When the captured materials reached Bletchley Park, the reaction bordered on disbelief. This was not theory, not mathematics. It was the enemy's own keys, their procedures laid bare. For weeks afterward, Enigma decrypts flowed with terrifying clarity. Naval traffic that had resisted attack suddenly yielded in volume. U-boat movements, supply schedules, operational orders, all readable. It was, as one cryptanalyst later recalled, like turning on the lights in a darkened room. But the victory carried danger. The Germans could not be allowed to know. Convoys could not suddenly evade every trap. U-boats could not be annihilated wholesale. The intelligence had to be used sparingly. Plausibly, at BBITU headquarters, Donat studied reports with growing irritation. Losses were mounting. Submarines vanished without warning. Rendezvous failed. Yet there was no obvious breach. Enigma procedures were sound. No evidence of capture. Lemp's boat was assumed lost with its crew. The conclusion, again, was bad luck. The scientists agreed. Meanwhile, the war expanded. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The scope of Enigma traffic exploded. Army group orders crackled across the ether, detailing advances, fuel shortages, and frantic requests for reinforcements. At Bletchley Park, new sections formed to handle the flood. Linguists worked alongside mathematicians, parsing military jargon and regional slang. Ultra reports now influenced not only naval operations, but land campaigns thousands of miles away. In North Africa, British commanders began to anticipate the movements of General Erwin Rommel with uncanny accuracy. Fuel convoys destined for the Africa Corps were intercepted. Attacks landed where defenses were weakest. Rommel suspected betrayal. He wrote bitterly of leaks and spies. He never suspected Enigma. German cryptographic authorities, faced with growing Allied success, ordered incremental changes. Procedures tightened. Keys changed more frequently. But the machine itself remained untouched. The belief in its perfection was absolute. To question Enigma was to question German engineering, and by extension, German superiority. At Bletchley Park, the pace became relentless. Hut after hut sprang up. Women of the Women's Royal Naval Service operated bombs around the clock, hands moving with practiced efficiency, ears attuned to the rhythm of machines that never slept. Alan Turing, increasingly isolated, focused on refinement. He argued that reliance on luck-captured codebooks, operator mistakes was dangerous. The system had to survive without them. He pushed for statistical methods, for deeper exploitation of structure rather than habit. Some listened, some did not. Then came a shock. In February 1942, the Germans introduced a new naval Enigma with a fourth rotor. Overnight, the Atlantic went dark. The bombs fell silent. Messages that had been routine became indecipherable again. Losses soared. Convoys were slaughtered off the American coast, where defenses were unprepared and coordination poor. At Bletchley Park, morale plummeted. Months of progress evaporated. Turing and his colleagues faced their greatest test. Working under crushing pressure, they redesigned bombs yet again, adapting them to the new complexity. American resources were brought in. Across the Atlantic, facilities in Dayton, Ohio, began producing bombs in unprecedented numbers. The collaboration was tense, but necessary. By late 1942, the darkness began to lift. Keys fell. Messages returned. The U-boat menace, though still deadly, no longer held the initiative. Through it all, German scientists remained convinced they were safe. Post-war interrogations would reveal their mindset clearly. They believed Enigma too complex to fail, too elegant to be undone by human ingenuity. Any Allied success was attributed to espionage, radar, or chance. Never to mathematics, never to logic, never to the possibility that discipline itself, predictable, rigid, human, had become the cipher's greatest weakness. As 1943 approached, the balance of the war was shifting decisively. Factories outproduced U-boats. Air cover extended further into the Atlantic. And always, quietly, the flow of information from Enigma guided decisions at the highest levels. The German war machine still roared, but its voice, once thought private, had become an open book, and the men who believed themselves unheard continued to speak freely into the void, unaware that their words were shaping the very forces closing in around them. The 18th of March, 1943. Berlin, Germany. Snow melted into gray slush along Wilhelmstrasse as Colonel Rudolf Schmundt stepped briskly into the Reich Chancellery, clutching a leather folder thick with reports that refused to align with the confidence still projected in public. Inside the briefing room, maps covered the walls, their neat symbols belying the growing disorder beneath. Red grease pencil marks showed U-boat losses climbing month by month. Supply routes flickered in and out of viability. Entire operations seemed anticipated before they unfolded. Schmundt was not a cryptographer. He was a soldier, and soldiers knew when something fundamental was going wrong. At the head of the table, senior officers listened as Naval and Air Force representatives presented their findings. The Atlantic, once a killing ground for Allied shipping, was becoming a graveyard for German submarines. In the Mediterranean, Axis convoys vanished with alarming regularity. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces appeared uncannily prepared for German offensives. Someone, somewhere, seemed to know too much. The discussion turned, inevitably, to betrayal. Security officers outlined investigations into espionage networks. Abwehr files were reviewed. Suspects were named, interrogated, cleared, or quietly removed. Radio discipline was blamed. So was pilot error. So was bad weather. What was not blamed was Enigma. The idea barely surfaced. When it did, it was dismissed with irritation. The Chiffrierabteilung had examined the machine countless times. The math was flawless. The permutations astronomical. To admit failure would be to admit that German science so central to the Reich's identity had been outmatched. And that was unthinkable. In a laboratory outside Berlin, engineers ran test encryptions, confirming what they already believed. No plaintext patterns emerged. No obvious vulnerabilities revealed themselves. They saw no evidence of compromise. Their confidence was reinforced by theory, not experience. Across the channel, experience told a different story. At Bletchley Park, Hut 8 and its sister sections operated under constant strain. The bombes, now more numerous and powerful, thundered day and night. Messages poured in faster than they could be processed. Ultra reports stacked up, each demanding judgment. Act, delay, or ignore. Every decision carried consequences. Too much success would raise suspicion. Too little would waste the advantage. Senior officers like Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham and General Dwight D. Eisenhower received intelligence that bordered on omniscience. They were warned repeatedly. The source must never be revealed. Plans were crafted with elaborate cover stories. Reconnaissance flights were ordered after the fact. Fake intelligence leaks were planted. Sometimes, operations were deliberately allowed to fail to preserve the illusion. The cost was measured in lives. Those who bore that knowledge carried it in silence. Alan Turing watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. The system he had helped build was working perhaps too well. He worried not about German brilliance, but German pride. A rational enemy might re-examine assumptions. A desperate one might do something unpredictable. In late March, a report crossed his desk detailing a German inquiry into radio security failures. It dismissed cryptographic compromise entirely. Turing exhaled slowly. For now, arrogance remained their shield. On the front lines, German officers felt the pressure without understanding its source. U-boat commanders complained that Allied escorts seemed to appear from nowhere. Luftwaffe pilots reported fighter cover, waiting at exact altitudes and times. Panzer units ran into prepared defenses again and again. Morale suffered. Some spoke quietly of fate turning against Germany. Others blamed leadership. Few questioned the machine that sat faithfully beside them, clicking and whirring as it always had. In April 1943, Dönitz ordered even stricter radio discipline. Messages were shortened. Silence was encouraged. But war demanded coordination, and coordination demanded communication. Each transmission, however brief, fed the Allied system. Each Enigma message, encrypted with absolute confidence, became another piece of the puzzle. By May, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its climax. U-boat losses became unsustainable. Wolf packs dissolved under relentless air and sea attack. The tide had turned decisively. In Berlin, reports used new language, defensive, cautious, tinged with disbelief. The machine that was supposed to guarantee secrecy had not failed them, they insisted. Reality had. At Bletchley Park, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. The realization set in quietly. The enemy still did not know, and as long as that remained true, the Allies would continue to see into the heart of German operations. The illusion of invincibility held just long enough to ensure its own destruction. The 16th of January 1944. Southwick House, Hampshire, England. A cold rain fell against the windows of the manor as General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood before a long table strewn with maps of northern France. His hands braced against the wood as he studied the narrow strip of coastline that would soon decide the fate of Europe. Around him, senior commanders spoke in low voices. Every beach, every tide, every road inland had been argued over for months, but the most valuable intelligence lay not on the maps themselves, but in the thin folders marked Ultra that arrived daily under armed guard. They revealed what the Germans believed. At Bletchley Park, the work had entered a new phase. Enigma decrypts no longer merely reacted to enemy movements, they shaped grand strategy. Messages from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht detailed fortification efforts, troop dispositions, and, most critically, German assumptions about Allied intentions. The picture was remarkably clear. The Germans expected the invasion. They just expected it in the wrong place. Operation Fortitude, the vast deception plan designed to convince Hitler that the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, relied on many tools: fake armies, inflatable tanks, double agents, but its backbone was Enigma. German messages discussing the Phantom First U.S. Army Group, supposedly under General George S. Patton, confirmed the deception was working. They believed what they were being shown and reported it faithfully. In Hut 3 and Hut 6, analysts tracked these beliefs like weather systems. Every shift in tone, every reinforced unit, every panicked query from a field commander was noted. When German intelligence officers debated Allied landing dates and locations, their arguments arrived in plain English on Bletchley Park desks. The enemy's mind was no longer opaque. It was legible. Alan Turing, though increasingly removed from day-to-day operations, understood the gravity of this moment. Years of grinding effort, of sleepless nights and incremental progress had converged here. If Enigma remained secure in German eyes for just a few more months, the greatest amphibious invasion in history might succeed. If not, catastrophe loomed. German cryptographic authorities continued routine reviews. No alarms were raised. The volume of traffic was immense. The need for coordination along the Atlantic Wall was constant. Messages flowed. So did their contents. On the 5th of May 1944, Enigma decrypts revealed a German report assessing Allied capabilities. It concluded that any major landing would target Pas-de-Calais. Normandy was mentioned only as a diversion. At Southwick House, Eisenhower read the summary twice. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. In early June, as weather delayed the invasion, Enigma messages betrayed German confusion. Units stood down. Alerts were cancelled. Some commanders left their posts to attend war games. Others took leave. The opportunity widened. On the night of June 5, Allied airborne troops lifted off, engines roaring into the darkness. At the same time, at Bletchley Park, analysts intercepted frantic German transmissions as reports of paratroopers filtered in. The reaction was fragmented. Some believed it a feint. Others argued for immediate response. The confusion played out in real time on British desks. The 6th of June, 1944. As dawn broke over the channel, German commanders struggled to form a coherent picture. Enigma messages flew between headquarters, filled with uncertainty and contradiction. Was this the invasion or a distraction? Should reserves be committed or held back for Pas-de-Calais? Hitler slept. Orders were delayed. At Southwick House, Eisenhower received confirmation that German armored divisions remained largely in place, waiting for an attack that would never come. The gamble had worked. Throughout D-Day and the days that followed, Enigma continued to provide insight. Counterattacks were anticipated. Reinforcements were tracked. Weaknesses were exploited. The beachhead held. German scientists, even as the situation deteriorated, clung to their faith in Enigma. Post-war interrogations would reveal their astonishment. They had never imagined that the Allies could read not just tactical messages, but strategic deliberations at the highest level. To them, it defied logic. To the men and women at Bletchley Park, it was the culmination of years of disciplined effort. As Allied forces pushed inland, the role of Enigma decrypts began to diminish. The war was now being fought in the open, but the advantage gained in secrecy had carried them across the most dangerous threshold. The enemy had been heard, understood, and misled, all without ever knowing his voice was no longer private. The 12th of September 1944. The night sky flickered orange as Allied bombs fell across the city, each explosion rattling windows and nerves alike. While inside a reinforced communications bunker, Captain Ernst Weber adjusted his headset and waited for the next transmission. The Reich was no longer confident. It was reactive. Messages arrived in bursts, urgent, fragmented, often contradictory. Orders were revised, rescinded, reissued. The tone had changed. Gone was the assured precision of earlier years. In its place was strain. Weber typed steadily into the Enigma, rotors spinning as faithfully as ever. The machine had not changed. The war around it had. On the Western Front, German units fell back under relentless pressure. In the east, the Red Army surged forward with brutal momentum. Supply lines disintegrated. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Yet communication remained constant. Command demanded updates. Field units pleaded for guidance. Every message, no matter how desperate, was encrypted. At Bletchley Park, the flood of decrypts was overwhelming. Sections worked in overlapping shifts, parsing the unraveling of the German war machine almost in real time. There was a grim intimacy to it now. Messages spoke of shattered divisions, of abandoned equipment, of commanders requesting permission to retreat and being denied. Some spoke of morale breaking, others of fanatic resolve. Ultra-intelligence guided Allied advances with surgical precision. Encirclements tightened. Breakthroughs exploited known weaknesses. German forces were outmaneuvered again and again, often wondering how the enemy seemed to anticipate their every move. The secrecy remained absolute. Even as victory approached, discipline did not falter. No one spoke of Enigma outside approved channels. Many Allied soldiers would go to their graves, never knowing why certain orders had been issued, or how close some operations had come to disaster. In Germany, suspicion intensified, but still not in the right direction. Investigations focused on officers captured at the front, on resistance groups, on traitors real and imagined. Cryptographers continued to assert Enigma's security. They had changed procedures, added complexity. Nothing had worked. Yet the assumption held. The machine was sound. The fault lay elsewhere. By late 1944, desperation crept into German communications. Hitler's directives, transmitted and retransmitted, demanded impossible feats from depleted units. The Ardennes offensive, one last gamble, was planned in secrecy. Its success dependent on surprise. Enigma carried the plans. At Bletchley Park, analysts read them. The scale, the objectives, the vulnerabilities all laid bare. Allied commanders were warned. Reserves were positioned quietly. When the attack came in December, it achieved temporary shock but not strategic surprise. The Germans could not understand how their secrecy had failed again. As winter deepened, the collapse accelerated. Messages grew shorter, more chaotic. Some units stopped transmitting altogether. Others sent final reports before being overrun. The tone shifted from command to confession. In April 1945, as Soviet troops closed on Berlin, Enigma machines were destroyed by the hundreds. Operators smashed rotors, burned codebooks, obeying standing orders to deny the enemy any cryptographic prize. Weber, in his bunker, hesitated for a moment before lifting a hammer. The machine had been his constant companion, a symbol of order in chaos. He brought the hammer down. At Bletchley Park, the work slowed. Intercepts dwindled. The war they had been listening to for 6 years faded into silence. There was no announcement, no ceremony. One day, when Berlin fell, Allied forces captured remnants of the German cryptographic establishment. Engineers and scientists were questioned. They were confident. Even in defeat, many insisted Enigma had never been broken. When told otherwise, they laughed. They demanded proof. The proof would not come. Not yet. The secret was locked away, deemed too valuable to reveal, too entwined with future security to be exposed. For the men and women who had lived inside the enemy's communications, the end was strangely anticlimactic. Victory had been achieved not with a final triumph, but with the quiet absence of the voices they had followed for so long. The silence was complete. The 19th of October, 1974, Munich, West Germany. A thin autumn rain streaked the windows of a modest apartment as Professor Wilhelm Fenner folded the newspaper slowly, his hands trembling despite decades of disciplined control. The headline spoke of newly released British intelligence files. Bletchley Park. Enigma. The words felt unreal. Fenner had once been one of Germany's senior cryptographic authorities, a man who had lectured officers and engineers alike on the theoretical perfection of the Reich's cipher systems. Now, in retirement, he read that the Allies had been inside German communications for most of the war. Not guessed, not suspected. Read. He leaned back in his chair, staring at nothing. Across Europe and North America, similar moments were unfolding. Former German naval officers, signals specialists, and scientists encountered the truth for the first time, not through interrogation or defeat, but through history books and declassified documents. Many reacted with disbelief, some with anger, a few with something quieter and more unsettling. Recognition. They pored over the details as they emerged. The Polish mathematicians, the bombs, the cribs, the procedural weaknesses. The mathematics that had seemed so elegant now appeared brittle. Not wrong, just incomplete. At conferences and academic journals, debates ignited. How could something so complex have failed so completely? The answer was uncomfortable. The failure was not the machine. It was the assumption that humans could operate it perfectly. German cryptography had trusted discipline absolutely. It had assumed that operators would never repeat phrases, never cut corners, never behave like men under stress. It had assumed that no one else could match German mathematical rigor. In Britain, surviving veterans of Bletchley Park watched the reaction unfold with mixed emotions. Some felt vindicated. Others felt only exhaustion. They had lived with the knowledge for decades. Now the world was catching up. Alan Turing was not among them. He had died in 1954, long before the secret emerged. His contributions still classified. His reputation defined by tragedy rather than triumph. Only now did the public begin to grasp the scale of what he had done. Statues were raised, buildings named, books written. But for those who had known him at Bletchley, the recognition felt bittersweet. In Germany, the reassessment cut deep. The Enigma had been more than a machine. It had been a symbol of intellectual superiority. To learn that it had been defeated, systematically, patiently, and largely without the Germans ever noticing, was a blow to national pride that lingered long after the war. Some former cryptographers admitted, privately, that the signs had been there. Too many coincidences. Too many narrow escapes by the enemy. But admitting doubt during the war would have meant challenging authority, doctrine, and identity. That, too, had been unthinkable. Historians now measured the impact with cold clarity. Enigma decrypts had shortened the war by an estimated 2 years. Millions of lives, Allied and Axis alike, had been spared by earlier victories, avoided battles, disrupted campaigns. The war's outcome had not hinged on a single breakthrough, but on sustained access to the enemy's thoughts. It was intelligence warfare at its most decisive. As the story entered classrooms and documentaries, a simpler narrative sometimes emerged, a lone genius cracking an evil code. The reality was more complex. It was a collective effort, spanning nations, disciplines, and years. Mathematicians, engineers, linguists, operators, couriers, machines built and rebuilt, mistakes made and corrected, and always, the enemy's unshakable confidence working against him. Fenner folded the newspaper again and placed it on the table. Outside, traffic passed. The war was long over, but its final lesson had arrived late. Security, he realized, was never absolute. Not in steel, not in machines, not in mathematics. It lived and died with human behavior. That was the truth German scientists had never been allowed to confront during the war. And it was the truth that now, at last, closed the circle. The code had not merely been cracked. It had been trusted into defeat.